welcome to the All Things Social Impact podcast. I'm your host, Andrea Kanaris, and today I'm joined with Marcus Curcija. Pronounced that correctly?
Yeah.
Great. Marcus, would you like to start by telling us a little bit of your story, a bit about your background?
Sure, I'd love to. Well, first, let me say a very big thank you to you, Andrea, for having me on here as your podcast guest. And I feel quite honored to be episode number 1. Really looking forward to this series and really appreciate the work that you're doing. Now on to the background. I think it's important to state where I'm from, which is in the Rust Belt of Pennsylvania in the Appalachians, a place called Johnstown, Pennsylvania, which was known for its flooding. And there I really sort of learned the value of socioeconomic challenges and the importance of trying to help people. We'll leave it at there for now. I'm sure we'll get into that a bit more later, but that is really where I always think back and want to give back and think back to where I'm from and where my roots are. And so that, funny enough, actually got me my first posting for the U.S. Department of the Interior Office of Surface Mining. I had put my name on a list for government internships. And once they saw where I was from, I got a call immediately. And so there I was able to advise on stakeholder engagement with some brownfield sites. And they eventually put me onto data collection up and down the East Coast for a lot of mining reclamation initiatives. So that then, I was studying tourism at the time. And luckily I was in tourism at around the time when it was going from mass tourism to sustainable tourism. So I had I really got exposed to environmental and social principles early on. And I just loved it. It was absolutely meaningful to me as both personally and professionally. And so that really, the stakeholder engagement aspect and then the environmental and social aspects really carried on and still continue to carry on throughout my career. Following my studies, I went on to work for a consulting firm and sort of toyed around for a little bit in Western Pennsylvania doing some tourism work. But when the global financial crisis came, I came back to Australia. And this is where my career really started to take shape because I focused on conflict management between stakeholder groups for my PhD. And during that time, I did some international work in the Solomons, did a project in Papua New Guinea, really drove outcomes or influenced outcomes is what I should say in several different countries while I was collecting data. But the most important thing is I developed a model during my PhD, which formed the basis of a business that I formed later in my career called Insight into Impact. And I found all kinds of innovative ways to commercialize that model by gathering stakeholder perspectives for everything from conflict management to organizational decision-making to regulatory reporting. And so that I think really helps define me as a professional and my place in social value, being able to calculate social impact, and really laying the foundation for why I believe you approached me for this podcast.
Yeah, that is such a great introduction. Thank you so much. I mean, some of that I didn't particularly know about you, but it's really interesting how you moved from Pennsylvania to Brisbane, both flood plains, I will add. So like you, we share that background, that sort of personal background of, I remember the 74 floods in Brisbane. I remember, my father down there helping people get out of, flood when I was only young. And then, of course, going through the 2011 floods and then again in 2014. So have both personal and professional experiences with floods, as part of the Mud Army in 2011, seeing people who had been through both the 2011 floods and then again in the 74 floods and then again in 2011. So, really seeing the impact it has on people to go through these things. I think it does change the psyche in terms of how you think about, like you said, social value, social impact. And then, there's a marriage, I noticed you said, between your personal and your professional by getting into social impact. So it would be really nice perhaps if we start by defining, because you mentioned a few terms there: social value, social impact. and I believe it was social performance.
I think I
So,
did.
for those listening, and some of them are early careers, and I think even some of the people with a bit more experience, we don't always. Sometimes we'll use them interchangeably. So if you're new to social impact in its broader sense, some of these terms might be a bit confusing. So how about we start with maybe perhaps defining, when you say social value, social impact, social performance, what exactly we're talking about?
Yeah, we'd love to. And I'm just going to give very sort of generic answers to this. And I'd want to start off by saying that, I think the semantics and all this terminology to a certain degree has intimidated some people when it comes to the social aspects of doing business, because again, it can be very confusing. So happy to help define or shape what those meanings are. So when it comes to social value, first and foremost, I think the way to understand that is that the world is dynamic, and social aspects, communities, stakeholder groups, businesses are very dynamic, and the appreciation for understanding and appreciation those dynamics and how they relate to society as whole and to the conduct of business and or governmental affairs.
Yeah.
I just want to sort of say that many of us know somebody from, say, the LGBTQI community, people that may be going through economic challenges, may have an alcohol or drug problem. And, it's important to recognize that many of these people are in our communities, are in our family, in our homes, in the mirror, and how important it is to appreciate that life is dynamic and we need to value that. And that's a huge opportunity to tap in business wise. If we can understand that, we can drive good business. Now, I perform as a sort of a conduit between community and business, but I keep bringing it back to business because, as I will probably point out later, is it has to make business sense to make something sort of succeed in the professional world. And so you have to continue to say, okay, well, market trends, what are sort of, where's the market headed and so forth. And again, many of these things are reactive. And I think if you can understand social value and the dynamics attached to social value, then you can sort of maybe start to get ahead of that curve a little bit and start to appreciate your own team, your customers, the people out in the community that are going to, before social license, here's a fourth term for us. Social license used to be a thing, but it's no longer good enough to have social license, just to get okay, well, yes, you're welcome to operate here. Who wants that? Let people appreciate you and respect you and want you in their communities, not just sign off on your presence. And, I think that, so again, social license has moved into, social well-being, social benefits. And by that, I mean, how can we make people's lives better? So that is social value, making people's lives better. And that just doesn't include the people that look like you or act like you, but everybody. Okay. That's number one. Number two.
It's a social value taken care of.
Yeah, I know. We might spend the whole hour just talking about these three definitions.
Yeah, and just to throw it in, you threw in another term. So we'll park that for now.
And then we have social performance. Now, social performance is really around, how do companies, how do they perform within the market, within the community, and so forth. But I think it also goes beyond that, beyond how they're performing and reacting and responding to their stakeholders. But how do we measure that? All right, because really, for a company to do it better, you must be able to measure your performance. So, the textbook definition is just, performing well within community and respecting that. But I'd like to think that as a society, we should be moving quickly beyond that and start saying, how do we do it better? How do we continually do it better? And the only way you're going to know if you're doing it better is by measuring it, managing it, monitoring it, measuring it, monitoring, managing it again. So that's social performance to me.
Yeah.
And then social impact. Social impact is really a way to sort of measure, well, it's not sort of, it is a way to measure the gross positive or negative impact of an activity on a community and or other stakeholders. Typically, it's measured over the long term. In the more short term, that would be considered outcomes. So we can look at outcomes and say, okay, well, this is what the outcome of this activity was, but you really won't be able to understand impact until you start to do a longitudinal study. And again, that impact may be positive or negative, but the importance of measurement and understanding what went wrong, what were the variables in that, connected to that certain action, and starting to dissect that and understand that, again, to improve behavior and performance. So they're all very intricately linked. So social value is sort of this broad understanding that we need to do something, whereas social performance is about doing it and measuring it, in my opinion. And then social impact is about measuring it and being able to evaluate it to then influence the social performance and therefore make the social value.
Yeah. Thank you very much for that, because I think it really helps our listeners when we're having this discussion. When we talk about these things, they've got some context of what we mean. Now, just a disclaimer to that is they may talk to other people who use some of these terms interchangeably, but for the purposes of this discussion, we've got a very clear what we're talking about, and I think that's really helpful. So you sort of mentioned some things here that I think are indicative of perhaps how you define social impact broadly, and that had relationships to things like, well-being, benefits, shared value within communities. The fact you used the word dynamic a lot, and bringing back businesses. You sort of really place things in businesses. So you described yourself as this interface between the community and the business. So for people listening and they're sort of thinking, how do you get into this? I suppose could you talk about, could you give some insights, I guess, to our listeners around, what does that all mean in terms of, perhaps you've got an example of where you did this for somebody where, what has business got to do with social value, and how far does that go in terms of, you talked about corporate social responsibility or social license to operate, these kinds of terms people might be familiar with. But what does it mean in practical, on the ground experience doing your job mean when you're talking about being that conduit between business and community?
Yeah, I think so. No, this goes back some time. And again, being originally from the United States, and this is a bit of a tangent, but from my understanding, here in Australia, is that obviously the government used to be a lot more involved in social policy and creating social benefits and establishing a system for the people. Right, as time moved on, that government influence and that sort of that profound ability of the government to help ensure a more equitable way of life has decreased. And again, I could be wrong here, but this is my understanding of the situation in Australia, and quite frankly, all over in other Western nations across the world. Let's be honest.
Yeah.
And so during that time, what we continue to see is that there are marginalized members of the community who continue to generation after generation suffer. Now, or I shouldn't say suffer. That's a completely misguided word. Continue to have challenges. Continue to have challenges.
Yeah.
Right? So again, that word was completely inappropriate. Sorry for that. But continue to have.
Although we must point that, in some instances, suffering is a part of their journey, right? I mean, we know suffering can happen to anybody, but more vulnerable groups or more, disadvantaged groups quite often can be more prone to suffer in society. So I think whilst it might not seem appropriate, there is some validity to that word in this context.
And I guess the thing, and just continuing on with that, is that if that's what's occurring, then what's the driver to change things? What to break away from certain things, because it's very hard to find the motivation when that is sort of a component of your life. Anyway, back to the marginalized members of the community. So that's one aspect. And quite frankly, business, and bringing this back to the business aspect of it, is have often just sort of placed that off to the side and said, well, that's that segment, or that's that cohort of community or society. But more and more, as we become aware as a culture, as a population, and this is globally, not just here in Australia, we have to recognize that, well, it is occurring, that there's recognition that, as mentioned before, it is dynamic, and we can relate to these people. We know these people. We may be these people. And there's other issues going on in community that do drive things such as social license. And they're all rather interconnected. And so to take a step back, I think it's about saying business has recognized the value of stakeholder input and or achieving social, again, it was social license before, but the mining industry, or the infrastructure industry a couple of years ago, what was it, like $20 billion or something was lost in like 1 year just due to conflict. And I think that was globally, but still, that is massive.
Staggering amount of dollars. Businesses don't like to lose money.
No.
And it doesn't help the bottom line.
100%. So if you can keep communities and society and other stakeholders sort of to understand that you do want to give back, that you are considering their perspectives, their what their community needs, what they need as a culture or as a cohort, then obviously that is better for business. Yeah. And so I think, though, full circle, that it's all rather linked. And from a business standpoint, community sort of most of the time looked at as a whole, but community often sees these dynamics and they say, well, we may be struggling because, mining has taken away all the jobs and the cost of living has gone up and so forth. So you have to really sort of understand how the dynamics of all of these things interplay. Community, which business now wants to be on the side of, is interrelated and very much interconnected. And all of these things are playing into their perspective at all times. Meanwhile, the community may be lashing out about, drilling or fumes or the cost of living, right? Mm-hmm. And so all of these things interrelate. They all play on each other. And so it's about breaking this stuff down and understanding these various components. So one, business can perform better. And two, so community can have some wider benefits, whether it's the elimination of fumes, or not having to hear drilling, or the cost of living going down. And in return, and this comes to that whole social value, some people in society, some segments of society may start to find that struggle a little less burdening.
Yeah. I think that is a great, and I see a segue here. It was a really great, thank you for doing that, because I think a lot of people, especially when they first start off, don't always kind of have a natural connection of, some of these social issues that are considered social issues, which, like you pointed out, traditionally was a government realm, strictly. I would say in Australia, it wasn't necessarily other than maybe them making a donation here and there to some community, not necessarily, but some may have. But it certainly evolved in Australia, as you rightly put, into more focus on businesses. And I think you gave a really nice, eloquent response as to why that may be the case. You said a couple of things that I'd like to maybe pick up the conversation on, because I think there's some really interesting points in here. So, for example, you were talking about, let's highlight why it's important and how it manifests in communities. So in Australia, for example, and you would have come around this time, if I remember correctly. So you came around after the global financial crisis. So there was a bust in the mining industry at that time. And Queensland, being a mining state, certainly felt the pinch of that. And we saw towns like Moorumba, for example, really feeling the pinch. So we can unpack some of what that might mean, just to make it in real terms for people. It can redefine who's vulnerable, or, as you say, marginalised in a community. So traditionally it would be people who've, not part of the mainstream. So, for example, they're in an outer group, or they've got a social problem in terms of maybe they're homeless, maybe they've got a drug problem, etc. But when you had the bust in Queensland with the mining, some of these mining towns were experiencing such a spike in the cost of living, like through the boom part, where the cost of living went up so high because rents were ridiculously unaffordable, where you found that workers such as teachers, nurses, students, these really essential workers for health and education couldn't afford rent in Moranbah, in some of these mining towns, or towns where mining is one of the key industries. So all of a sudden you've got people who are getting by and, doing well, and then all of a sudden things just spiral upward in terms of cost, and people who were doing okay all of a sudden find they can't. So it's no longer just vulnerable groups gets redefined to, well, anyone who can't afford, that the people who are within that vulnerable group kind of expands greatly, and it hits them in the hip pocket in terms of week by week being able to afford to live, find somewhere to live. Commuting to work becomes more challenging, more difficult, because maybe to afford they have to move further away. Maybe the cost of grocery goes up. All sorts of things start to impact on these communities. But then we had the bust, right? And the opposite can be true. So sometimes, depending on the town, some of these impacts go up and down, like depending on what's happening in the economy. They're more as a town, if you like, or as a community as a whole. Because unlike a city, communities might be, subsets of, say, Brisbane broadly, or if you're in America, Pennsylvania broadly. But when you're in some of these rural towns, it's really clear who the community is. It's like geographically very, very clear who the community is. And that also means that it's very clear that they're going up and down with their economy. They're not close to the city. They're further away. They're reliant on this one or two industries. And if those one or two industries aren't doing well, then they suffer, which leads into what you were talking about, performance. So if we look at that and we unpack vulnerability, I always find that social impact, and please, and I guess we're still talking about the defining social impacts. I know for me, social impact quite often is about the vulnerable groups. I think that sometimes we can get lazy. We've got to be careful not to get lazy about who is vulnerable, because it can vary very greatly, and quite often be people you wouldn't expect. As in, on the surface, you might go, they're medical professionals, they're well employed, they're in the middle class, so to speak. They're not going to be vulnerable. But if they're close to the site, or the cost of living goes drastically up, or their rents go through the roof, all of a sudden these people become extremely vulnerable. So how do you determine vulnerability when you're doing a social impact assessment?
Wow.
Just a small question.
So I'll try to keep this one short. And I think, and again, I like to make a lot of my work come back to perspective.
Yep.
Perspective of individuals, perspective of stakeholder groups as a whole. So I suppose, and this is, I know you and I have had a conversation about this previously, but how is our actions actually perceived? We may go into a site and think that, oh, these people are vulnerable. Yeah. And we, as professionals and with experience, may pinpoint them as vulnerable. However, they may not see themselves as vulnerable. And this is exactly to your point, what you were just saying, is that you may say that they're middle class, but yet they are. So how do I do it? Is simply that I would like to know what the perspective of that particular person is. So that way I'm not, or stakeholder group is, so that way I am not pushing my experience and my perspective and something that they really don't need or desire onto them. So I would first seek to understand, to answer your question succinctly. Seek to understand that perspective, and if there actually is a cause for us to get involved.
Yeah, yeah. I I think that's probably raises the question to me then in, when you say seek to understand, and we did have this conversation because I think it's really important to seek to understand in social impact because there's what you so for example you do your social baseline, you do your homework on a town or a location or a business, and you can read things and sort of go, oh yeah, I think I know about this place now because I've read some data and I've read some reports on this place, and I've googled it, which is of course all the tools that we would use and you would be expected to do before you go out into the field to have a look at these locations. But you also have to suspend some of that judgment. And I think that's the difference, isn't it? Like you can go in with a whole heap of knowledge, but suspend the judgment and be open to seek to understand. So, what are the tools you use to do that? Because I think you and I agree on this. Social impact, if we took it into a social impact assessment, which I think would be one of the earliest manifestations of what we're talking about, it's where you start, identifying risk and then social impact assessment. So, what are the skills that we would use to do that? Like, what is the approach you would adopt?
Look, the skills that you need, I think, and I think this comes back. Yeah, I think number one, I think being your authentic self. So anytime you're going to go into communities or anywhere, be who you are. Don't try to be somebody else. And I think being comfortable, the fact that you are now immersing yourself into a community which is full of these dynamics and these different personalities and these different scenarios is essential. If you come in there wearing a different hat, people
Mm.
smell that a mile away, and we all have those stories.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And and so that's first and foremost to be right. But I think more technically, I think the skills that you need are the building off that authenticity, the ability to sort of relate to others. So be able
Yeah.
to hold a conversation, right?
Yeah.
Listen to what people are saying. Empathy, right? You
Yeah.
need to be empathetic of someone and the challenges that they're going through. Relatable if you can be. Not everyone has that life experience, but you
Yeah.
will gain it
Yes.
through this work.
Yeah.
More technical skills, I think documentation. So it's very, very important to document these interactions that you're having. So therefore you can start to recognize the patterns.
Yeah.
So understand the qualitative data, understand the type of individuals that you're talking to based off of their own words, right? Not your perception of them, because again, you may have it wrong. So
Yes.
prepare your questions well,
Yeah.
know what you're going to ask, guide them to the answers, and then document that. Use a tape recorder if you have to, because it's really impolite to be jotting all that stuff down in front of somebody. But most of the time, most people are open to recording them.
Yeah.
And again, I think that's after you've already formed a relationship with them. I think just to go in there and ask to do let me start recording you right now is going to come off as very unauthentic. So, have patience to sort of immerse yourself in the community, at least enough to meet a couple community champions. And that's the approach that I've often used and I've found
Yeah.
has worked best for my work, is identifying community champions that really resonate with me and vice versa, where they resonate with the work that I'm trying to do. They sort of we work well together. I'll summarize it.
Yeah.
And then have them be the advocate to introducing you to other people, maybe focus groups, just go and join people for a meal at the local dining hall or wherever.
Yeah.
And really just sort of immersing yourself. I think once you start to document this, then there's obviously a lot of research and as we like to call it, applied research, which we can get
Yes.
into here shortly.
Yeah.
And for our listeners, Andrea and I have a shared opinion that the
Me
vast
too.
majority of social work can be achieved through applied social research. And so what I've really been explaining here is how to be a good researcher.
You certainly have. That's exactly what I was thinking you were talking. I was like, these are really practical because these are some of what, and I hate the term, but I'm going to have to use it because that's how everybody talks about it. But it's soft skills. These are things that you may not have learnt at university per se, or you may have learnt it at a theoretical level. So you may know that you need to listen, but what does that actually mean? And you may need to, seek permission from, your respondents before you take them. But what does that actually mean? And I think you really touched on it really beautiful in terms, it's like immersing yourself. It's like showing respect. It's like taking the time. Don't rush in and go, hi, I'm here to do some research. I'm going to record you. It's setting the scene. It's giving them time to sort of feel comfortable with you, consenting to the engagement in that social impact, which is an applied research as you and I perceive it, and getting their consent to participate. Once you've got that rapport, because it's rapport building, which is another soft skill that a lot of people don't talk about. And these are really critical enablers for you to get anywhere in terms of, particularly, I think, the qualitative research, which, I find quantitative research is absolutely also a wonderful tool that we use in social impact and social research. What I also find is that it raises as many questions as you got answers to in the first place. And that's where, the qualitative data really shines in social impact in particular, because the impacts aren't equal to everybody. They're different even within communities, because it depends where you are personally, where you are in relation to the business, in terms of what kinds of impacts you may or benefits you may receive from it. So it's complex, and the listening and all that soft skills, and I do hate that term. I call them essential skills.
Yes, they are.
I think these are critical skills. I don't think we can understate just how important they are, and which is, I think, why you spent so much time focusing on it. So thank you for that. That's really important, I think, as we move forward. And for people who are thinking, oh, I might have to go out and do my first social impact, how am I going to do it? It's like breathe, and maybe go back and listen to what Marcus said about how you immerse yourself into a community. I think they're really good tips for people.
And one thing I want to add to that is especially since we're now talking about qualitative and quantitative data, is the more experience you have in the field and understanding these various aspects, walks of life, however you want to coin it, the better researcher you will be, because you start to understand where people are coming from, and you do start to recognize the dynamics, and that not everything fits in a box. The best things in life don't fit in a box. Social research doesn't fit in a box. Hence, it's such a struggle really pushing it, it was such a struggle pushing it for many years. But now,
and people don't like being in boxes. They don't like feeling like you're putting them in a box, either. So that doesn't bode well for trying to build a rapport and relationship with them in the long term.
They one of the best ways to build that rapport is to show people that you're listening, that you seek to understand.
And
that's so powerful.
Absolutely powerful. And I think I think that's a really good segue into say maybe some of the more technical skills that you may need to hone if you're going to get into social impact. The other thing I'd like to do with that as well, because you're talking about getting in there and doing it, but maybe if we can start linking, because we've been talking primarily about social impact assessment and determining what those social impacts and how you get that information from communities. Can we also, as we talk about the technical skills, start talking about how that translates and sets up for things like what you were talking about earlier with the social value and the social performance? Because, in a way, I think you and I have talked about in the past, social impact assessment and identifying social impacts isn't very useful unless you're going to do something with it.
No. Too often these things are done as a tick the box, and they sit on someone's shelf or on a hard drive or the cloud now for forever, right? The whole purpose of the social impact assessment is really to give a project or a business who will be later operating there a base understanding. We could even call it a baseline from that point in time.
Yeah.
But to give that company and or that project a base understanding of what things are and what they're dealing with there.
Yeah.
So therefore, if you have this general understanding around, these many, the five main components of a social impact assessment, then you can say, well, this is what we need to focus on. But first, you need to understand again, and this comes back to that perspective of how much does the community even value those things. So one, let's see what the data says and how people view these things, so that way we know where to put our focus. And we can value these things along with this community. We can do it together.
Yeah.
And now we can perform so that they're better off. And you know what? Us as a company are going to be better off for it too. Not only because we have reduced the conflict, but because we have shown our employees that we care. We have shown our stakeholders that we care, and we can work with community, and we can make life better. Wow. Brilliant. I mean, isn't that what?
Yeah, I think what you're talking about is a win-win-win kind of thing, and it starts to spiral upward instead of downward in terms of relationships. If you can understand your impacts in terms of the negative stuff, but also the benefits that potentially exist, you can both mitigate those negatives so that it's not so poorly felt within the community. And sometimes I believe, depending on the impact, you may even be able to reverse it into a positive. But also enhancing it to make sure that local communities really are the ones who are benefiting from the operation. Like, if you're going to experience the negative impacts, wouldn't it be great if you're also, a beneficiary to the benefits from that operation,
Well, look, you bring up a great point, and the terminology now, especially since I know a lot of students will be listening to this, the industry terminology that gets tossed around a lot now is legacy. Legacy, legacy, legacy. That's all you hear is legacy.
Yeah. Well, the Olympics is coming up, so we're going to hear it a lot more in relation to that one.
Look, and I think the Olympics provide a great example.
Yes,
they provide an amazing example. I mean, we have all heard of the World Cup or the Olympics case studies where marginalized community members get tossed out of where they're living, get pushed along. Cost of living goes through that. We've heard of all the challenges, maybe even some of the labor rights issues. And I think, especially being both of us being located in Brisbane, we have to recognize that 2032 Olympics are being held here. And what can we do as social practitioners to ensure that legacy is not just something that's talked about, that is actually achieved, and not just achieved for the communities, which is amazing and my main driver, but also for the businesses, so we can recognize and understand what good business models on a large-scale global event looks like. Now, to set that standard, I think, is really a call to action in my book.
And Marcus, the Olympics to me is right from the beginning when it first got announced. I've been excited about the Olympics. I love the Olympics, like most people. But as a social practitioner as well, whose focus has been social impact for the most part of my career. When I'm not doing policy and strategy and the like in government, I've been in the private sector doing social impact. And so to me, it's that from a professional perspective, I agree with you. Like, social impact practitioners should be the go-to people when it comes to legacy. This is what we have been doing. It's been our bread and butter for years. And I would hope that as we move forward, that there's more of people like us who are involved in understanding what legacy can look like, but how you achieve it, how you measure it, how you know that you're actually achieving it. And I would love to see a move away from only the quantitative measures of what legacy looks like, because it's more than that. It's the qualitative. It's how people experience it. It's how people perceive that they've experienced it. It's making sure that businesses, and like you said, it's in the Olympics, it's a really interesting one because, and it happens with social impact when you look at, I know, supply chains, but when you're talking about Olympics, it's like you rightly said, community gets expanded to not just the people who reside next door or the farmers who run an operation or landowners right next door to it. It's actually all the businesses that have an opportunity, including the arts and the entertainment industries, and it's actually all-encompassing industries when you think of the number of people that will descend upon Brisbane through the Olympics. How do you capitalize that, and how do you make sure that you not just manage and mitigate those negatives that you talk to, which will be increased house prices, one of the most common, especially when you're looking at a city that's already got a housing crisis, But how do you make sure that the businesses not just, I suppose, benefit through that short period before, during, and slightly after the games, but how do you capitalize that in the long term for businesses? Because they're part of the community now, community in its broadest sense, which is all the players in the community and their businesses. And I guess to me, it also brings the fact that when you're talking to people, they wear all sorts of hats. Their mother, daughter, son, father, uncle, cousin, business owner, teacher, whatever the case may be. So people are wearing more than one hat when you're talking to them in a scenario like the Olympics. I mean, in all of them, but particularly in the Olympics.
Yeah.
Kind of all of those things, I like the small questions, Marcus.
Obviously. Very obviously. Look, I think, and so just the summary, how do we ensure that communities can continue to have social benefit after the Olympics?
Yes, because as you rightly said earlier, legacy, which is what you would call, impact later, like immediate after the Olympics and during the Olympics, they're the outcomes of the Olympics, right? We did so much business during and, immediately after, but the further away you get from it, that's legacy, isn't it? That's the social impact. That's the legacy that gets left behind from having had the Olympics. And we don't want to be one of those cities that, has this infrastructure that never gets used. We want to make sure that the things and the decisions get made now, are actually able to provide legacy for 10, 15, 20 years post.
Well, that's what, when you plan it, you need to plan for the Olympics afterlife, and that's from an infrastructure standpoint. But when we're getting back to the the community members and communal benefit, and really and as you mentioned, this involves the companies and shared value, right? And so I think at the end of the day, it's about understanding. So let's just look at the community aspect first. The community aspect would be, what do those community members, and I'm talking about as a collective, and breaking it down into cohorts, actually desire? What do they need? What do they require? What do they perceive as being valuable? So that to their community. And so that could be anything from better access to transport to maybe a closer grocery store. Maybe it has to do with reduced crime. Maybe it has to do, so it's very broad as to what they may require and what they find is necessary. But it's then about working with them to design and plan around the Olympic Games, around that future. So you're not planning for the Olympic Games. You're planning for what happens afterwards. And guess what happens in the interim? The Olympic Games are a success. Why? Because people are happy. People are happy, so they're going to welcome the tourists. They're going to welcome the athletes. They're going to say, hey, come and spend your money here. And we're so happy because why? Now we have a train that's going to run for the next 30 years. Now we have bus routes. Now we have, now we have a heightened police force and we don't have to worry about crime or whatever, right?
Yeah.
And so by planning for those things, you can help make the Olympics better. But I think what's so important and what gets lost is obviously community perspectives differ. And they do change and they shift. As I mentioned the word many times, dynamic. So what a community needs now will probably need something different in 2032 or 2040. And so continuing to sort of check in and see, and monitor that changed in collective perspective, but also around what are the negative impacts as we proceed. So getting a community consultation on. So let's just say that there's Brisbane planners have already said, we're going to designate this area for a large Olympic park, right? Well,
Yeah.
what does that mean to people who are going to be displaced or caught up in the traffic and so forth? Now, you can't keep all the people happy all the time, but what you can try to do is mitigate as many of those negatives as possible. So if you put a solution in place that helps mitigate that negative, and what are you laying it forth? And maybe they'll say, okay, well, this negative ain't so good, but you know what? This benefit that you gave me is a little bit better, so I'm willing to make that trade-off, and I'm willing to hush up, or I'm willing to accept, because I realize that my livelihood, or overall my quality of life is now better. Yes, I may have a 10-minute longer commute, but I don't have to deal with crime outside my door every day, and now I can also catch the train when I want to go somewhere. And so again, these are very generic, but I think it is about
But I
finding.
think they're things that are really important, and I like the fact that you brought in trade-offs, because I think quite often decision makers are deciding what the community want to trade off on. And I think if we go back to where you started, which was like the importance of communication, the importance of engagement with the community, and that engagement really should be not just about, how does this affect you, but it's like, what do you want to see in the future? What kind of trade-off are you actually comfortable in making? So that the decisions the governments make are at least informed by where the communities, and there's a little bit of consent wrapped up in that whole, analysis of it. But I can't help to think that, health and well-being, when you talk about Olympics, and you think of some of the health data around, increasing things like diabetes, the fact that kids are less active than they used to be, they're spending more time. I would like to see how the Olympics can be pivotal in shifting the cultural way in which we engage with exercise, diet, how we live our lives in a way that's more active, that we eat better. Because if the Olympics does not epitomize, the ultimate in physical fitness, and I would hope that you could leverage some of that. And if you think of the infrastructure, like how can that infrastructure be not just for the Olympics, but how does that get left for the, Brisbane, Southeast Queensland, Australian community in terms of contributing to those skills, those infrastructure that get drawn into. There might be elite athletes, but you can roll that skill set, that knowledge, that infrastructure down to encourage people to adopt healthier lifestyles and improve their well-being.
At the very least, let's do it for the kids. I mean,
yeah, right. Some of us might be lost already in it, but the kids in particular, and that isn't that where legacy lies?
It is 100%
for the kids.
It is, and look, just to backtrack a little bit, I do want to mention that, just to clarify on one of my earlier answers is that, I say about, gathering the community's perspectives, but let's face it, sometimes when we have this engagement or these consultations, we only hear from those who show up at town meetings and speak the loudest.
Yeah.
We really, and this is why working with community champions and trying to relate or access these marginalized cohorts is so important, because of the dynamics I talked about and the influence that they have on everybody's everyday life, whether some people realize it or not, is that they need to have a say too, and how much more valued they would feel if someone actually asked them for their opinion and asked them to speak up and wanted them included in the decision making, and just didn't say, oh well, whatever you're doing is undesirable to my life and my decision making, right? So, getting back to why this is all important is that this is what influences the next generation. We could talk about generational poverty, but coming back to your point, let's do it for the kids. Let's put some of these things in place that shows a plan and shows incremental sort of improvements, impact on lifestyle. Life expectancy is too far away to measure, but you know what I mean? Some of these things, we've seen obesity in our schools go down by 2% and literacy up by 3%. Wow. We've actually done something that we can hang our hat on.
Yeah, I get it. I think that's probably why I get excited about the Olympics. I think, we all know there's particular holes we could fall into if we're not careful. And, maybe that's our risk assessment that comes in for having done social impact for so long. We see the alarm bells, but we also see the opportunities and the potential of where this can go. And for me, it was definitely the younger people, because I don't know if you know this, Marcus, but when I first left university from the social science degree that I did in social planning degree I worked for health for quite some time, in and out of health and in public health, in particular in aged care. So I'm familiar with the data, both from the health perspective, but also in my social impact assessments, and it's quite scary. It's a horrible situation to be in, where lifestyle illnesses such as diabetes is hitting children. That was when obesity in children is something that we never used to see, or it was so rare, and now it's a common occurrence. And I would love to see Brisbane Olympics used in a way that could actually address some of these issues, not to mention also the housing crisis. If we can leverage that to improve the situation, then that would be fantastic. Now, like you say, if we go back to the seek to understand, wouldn't it be great to tap into the collective knowledge of Brisbane, Queensland, Australia to address these problems? Take the opportunity to say there's a collective brain. Let's engage with them and see what the ideas are. Maybe someone's got an idea that, needs better consideration to address some of these things, right? We've got some really bright people in the country. Let's use them, right?
Well, here's the thing, and this is recognized in environmental work, but not so much in social, not as much in social, is that no one understands their community, just like no one understands their environment better than the farmers and the people who live there. Well, guess what? No one understands their community and the needs of the community more than the people who live there as well. And that includes every cohort.
Yeah.
And so, again, there are people who, if they feel that they're going to be valued and that they're going to be heard and listened to, and that they will participate. And not everybody, not everyone's into this, but you will get these ideas that you just mentioned, these really grand ideas from just everyday people who have thought about this from their lens, from that communal lens, over and over again, and it's just out of their reach. So how do we tap into making it a possibility?
Yeah, I found in my experience, both at the micro level, and the macro level, is that listening is the most powerful tool you will have in any work that you do with people, particularly vulnerable groups. So at one point I worked with settling refugees. So we're talking about, torture and trauma victims. And you don't achieve anything until they trust you. When they trust you, they will open up to you. They'll tell you their story, and it's an absolute privilege when someone does that. But you don't get there without actively listening and building trust and rapport. And in a time where I think there's an increasing focus on people's stories as being, critical, I think what's happening with the social media is this idea that people owe you their story. And I would love to people to go, no, you don't. No one owes you their story. You need to earn their story. It's a privilege for someone to share their story with you.
And the real story too. I think what we see so often is a filtered story, right? And when you, like you said, working with refugees or other, and look, it could be any group. It's about having them really share with you the value and why it's either helped them or hurt them or whatever it is, and understanding that relationship to how it's gotten there. And you do that at scale, right? When you start to understand this history and this experience and these perspectives at scale, what you start to recognize and what you start to see are the patterns of what could be tapped into, so that therefore you can start to make a little difference. You start to recognize these are the variables that we need to pinpoint. These are the things that we need to focus on. It doesn't have to be bigger than Ben-Hur. All it has to do is be calculated enough and at scale large enough to say, this is where we can pinpoint our focus. to mitigate the negative and, God willing, drive some positive.
And great. So that's a really good segue, because I agree with everything you said there. And let's build on that and say, well, you alluded to it, it's a data thing now. We're talking about that technical thing of actually taking what you've learnt from people, from the experiences, from the identification, from mitigation strategies that you may decide you want to implement. But there's a data element here, isn't it? Because if you want to monitor, like you said, measure, hit repeat, and keep going, because you don't want to, we have to make assumptions, right? It's predictive. We have to make some assumptions. So you have to, like you said, document those assumptions as part of your assessment, and also the reasons why you may be using those strategies. But you want to put, cautions around it. Let's monitor and measure it and see if we got it right, because we may have to tweak it. We may have to throw it out altogether, and maybe it doesn't do what we thought it was going to do, because you only know what you know at any point in given time. So how do you use data to do that? What's your approach? What's your recommendation? If someone's saying, I've got to do a social impact management plan, or I've got to develop a strategy for how I go from understanding what my social impacts are and how I'm going to mitigate them, and now I need to move forward. What do they need to have done to allow them to move forward in terms of understanding their performance?
Understand their performance. Wow. I mean,
again, another small question.
It's, I don't want to look. It depends. Is my honest answer, because there's so many variables, and every situation is different. But I think that's a very poor answer for a podcast. So let's say this. I believe that what they really want is the benchmarking, which we've already talked about during the social impact assessment process. So what is the benchmark? And then I think it's about getting the repeat participation. So can you get some of the people who already participated, if not all of them, but at least a select cohort who participated in your benchmarking process, to then come back and sort of monitor how their lives have changed? And what do they perceive as being the influence on that change, whether it be positive or negative? What do they perceive? Because as an outsider looking in, you're going to say, well, this happened and this happened and this happened. Probably not true. But they know where they've had these sort of milestones, or these these moments in life that have sort of intricately made it better or worse. Then once that's sort of achieved, and you can get these perspectives, it's about saying, okay, now we understand this collective at scale. We've been able to chase the benchmark. Then it's about an evaluation of, is anything really better here or worse for these participants? And what are we actually seeing in the publicized data, the public data? And let's sort of compare what the perception of that quant data that's not as intricate and detailed is saying to sort of that more qualitative, rich data that I'm analyzing. Is it lining up, or is it dissimilar? Now, if it's dissimilar, I strongly recommend trying to quantify that qualitative data, so you can then showcase it and say, this is the gap.
Yeah.
And if you're lucky enough and good enough researcher, guess what? How to address that gap probably came out in your interview, during your second interviews with that cohort.
Yeah. I think one of the important things, because like you say, it's a you got to practice the skill to get better at the skill. So the more you do this, the better you get at it. But I think you gave a nice framework. Start with your data set, understand what the impacts are, understand what you're doing, know what it is you'd at least think you'd like to measure, and know what those indicators might be. Asking yourself, is this actually going to measure what I think it's going to measure? So you do need a bit of thought up front, but I think you've given a process that helps. And then, have some kind of group, whether it be a community, reference group, or however you may want to set it up, that you can go back to. It can be your intel, for the community, because I agree with you, no one knows their community better than the person who's lived their whole lives, and lived that experience. And that's from a lot of different aspects. It's from an experiential perspective, but it's also a cultural understanding. because I find culture an interesting one. It's like the fish, you don't know you're in water unless you're in water, but at the same time, an outsider talking to someone about culture can only understand it from somebody who's actually lived there. It's like you kind of help them articulate their culture inadvertently, but no one can like you as an outsider cannot tell someone what their culture is. Like you can't. You can hear them and listen to them and then repeat back to them what you observed based on what they've said, and they will either confirm or deny whether you've understood them correctly from a cultural perspective.
You have brought up such a valuable point, and that is once you've analyzed the data, once you've summarized it, take it back and let those people review it, right? Because are you capturing it correctly? Right? Because there's researcher bias all the time. And so be able to give it back, especially if there's a different language. I mean, that opens up a whole other can of worms that we can maybe explore on another podcast, on another episode, sorry. But there is you have to give it back for them to say, yes, you have captured my opinion correctly, from my perspective correctly. And it's also about saying, an understanding, just to summarize, that things must be repeatable. So whether it's with the same audience or if it's the methodology or whatever, and that's the only way this applied social research method is going to be any good in the future. If you do something in isolation, it has very little value. It provides a snapshot, which is great. It's a moment in time, but you need to continue to revisit that to ensure that you are performing the way you should be.
Yeah. I have so many more questions, but I'm conscious of time. And I would like to say that I would love to have you back on, particularly to delve into the data stuff, and the performance stuff, because I really think that it's a underused resource of social scientists and social practitioners. I don't think there's enough of it. And not just in the social impact in mining or resourcing, but I think even in evaluation of social programs, which I've done before, and I'm sure you've come across, they do it, but not often enough, rather than it being entrenched, which then I think some of that understanding of what we're talking about, and there's so much I'd like to unpack, but I think that's perhaps another podcast where we can just focus and zoom in on some of those things, like what's the program logic's got to do with it and all that sort of stuff. But it's too technical and we haven't got enough time for that. But I think you did give a good high-level framework of how you link social impact and identifying the risk, the social impact, taking all those complex data sets and trying to make sense of it from a social performance point of view. And of course, just to link it back to the social value, because that's how you know whether or not you're having social value or not as well, right?
Well, I if you're going to drive a positive social impact.
Yeah.
and I just want to summate. Oh, sorry, what's that?
No, I just said yes, definitely.
I just want to summate that I think that when we talk about social performance, since we don't have a whole lot of time, is that be innovative. Make sure that you use innovative approaches. Don't say that these are my limitations or this is too hard. Find the solutions that present themselves. And what I mean by that is, if you look closely, there is 9 times out of 10, there's an opportunity that is presenting itself that you may just not recognize. Now, I realize that recognition comes through experience, but again, immerse yourself in a community, immerse yourself with various stakeholder groups, put yourself out there. And the more you put yourself out there, guess what? The more opportunities arise. It's not always in a comfortable space, but you will do good for both the community, which a lot of, we're all part of, and business, which is essential to this whole process.
Mark Curcija, thank you so much. That is such a great way to surmise it. I love the encouragement of being innovative and creative and not just doing a cookie cutter approach. I think that's really important. So thank you very much for your time. It's been lovely to having you on, and what a great way to kick off the professional series of the All Things Social Impact podcast.
Thank you very much for having me, Andrea. I really, really enjoyed this, and I really look forward to hopefully being invited back. So thank you.
Oh, definitely invited back. I think people are going to want to hear more about the social performance. And I certainly want to have that conversation with you. So if you're happy to, I'd love to have you back on.
Absolutely. Anytime.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed the All Things Social Impact podcast. You were listening to the Professional series. Remember to like this video and hit the subscribe button so you don't miss out on future episodes. I'd also like to invite you to the All Things Social Impact subscription site, where you'll have access to online tools, training, forums with like-minded social impact professionals. And once a month, you'll be able to come online and have discussions with me. I'll leave a link in the comments below. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments. Thank you, and I'll see you at the next episode.